Hi, in this class we're going to look at control structures in PHP. So a program doesn't necessarily start at the start and work all the way down to the bottom. It can skip ahead, or it can branch off, or it can do things over and over again. So we're going to look at if statements, and then we're going to look at loops. We're going to look at two kinds of loops. We're going to look at the while loop, and we're going to look at for loops. We're also going to take a look at arrays, which we could have done before now, but I wanted to wait until we knew about loops. And there's a special kind of a loop that we use in PHP for working with arrays also. So let's take a look then, and we'll start with the if statement. So what we're looking at today is this idea that you don't have to do everything in order. So under normal circumstances, PHP code will be executed in the order that it appears. So just go line by line by line by line. Now, what we're interested in doing is maybe branching off. So depending on certain circumstances, we might decide to go one way or another to do different things, and then maybe come back and join again. So it's a bit like a train going down a track. You know, we can branch off and go in different directions and rejoin later on. And the first thing we're going to look at is the if statement. So an if statement will do one of two different things depending on a certain value. So we have the if, and then there's a condition there. So that will be a Boolean expression that will evaluate to either true or false. If it's true, the if statement will execute the first block of code there that we see in green. And if the Boolean expression evaluates to false, it'll do the part that comes after the else. So depending on that value, it'll do one thing or the other. So here we're trying to decide whether to have a party or whether to have a quiet night in. And that'll depend on whether the budget for having a party is greater or less than the cost of having it. So if the budget is greater or equal than the cost, then that's good. So we will echo let's have a party, echo all welcome. But if the budget for the party isn't greater than the cost, so if we don't have enough money for the party, then we'll echo let's have a quiet night in. So this part here must evaluate to true or false. So in an if statement, that part there, the test, is always going to evaluate to either true or false. If it evaluates to true, then there'll be one or more statements here that will be executed. And if it evaluates to false, then the statements in the else part will be executed. Once the if statement is over then, once it's done its job, the program carries on as normal. So in any event, see you then will appear. Now you don't have to have the else part, you can leave that out. So here we could say, for example, tonight we're having pizza, so that's going to happen anyway. Now if budget is greater than 25, then we'll echo and wine. And we'll say see you then, in any event. So one of two things will happen here. We'll say tonight we're having pizza, see you then. Or it'll say tonight we're having pizza and wine, see you then. And whether we have the wine or not will depend on the value of budget. So if budget greater than or equal to 25 turns out to be true, and wine will be put in there. If budget greater than 25 turns out to be false, well then nothing happens. And we go straight to see you then. Here we are using an else if to add an extra condition. So here we're saying echo tonight we're having pizza. Now if budget is greater or equal to 55, so if we €55 or more, excuse me, then we're going to echo and champagne. If that turns out to be false, if budget greater than 55 is not true, if that's false, then we're going to go to the next part of the if statement. But this isn't an else on its own, it's an else if. So there's an additional test here that has to be passed. So here we're asking the question, is budget greater than 25? And if that turns out to be true, well then we echo and wine. If that turns out to be false, then we don't say anything. And then we carry on and have see you then at the end. So we can have several tests one after the other. We can string them along quite a complex way if we want. Interestingly, it's tempting to think maybe you could change these questions around. We could ask about the wine, the 25 first, and then ask about the 55. Do you think this would work? Well, this wouldn't work the way we would expect, okay? Because if budget is greater than 25, then it will say and wine. Now that part of the if statement is done then. And because that was true, it did the first part. And then it doesn't carry on, it just stops then. So it doesn't actually check to see if it's greater than 55. It would only check to see if it's greater than 55 if the first test failed. So if budget greater than 25, if that failed, well then it would go on to the else part of the if statement. And because it's an else if, the test there would be, is budget greater than 55? But that doesn't actually make sense, because if it's not greater than 25, it hasn't a hope of being greater than 55. So while reading this, it sounds like it might make sense. It doesn't really make sense at all. The questions have to be asked in this order. So the first question is it greater than 55? If it is greater than 55, say, and champagne. If it's not greater than 55, then we go to the next part. The next part says, is it greater than 25? If it's greater than 25, we say and wine. If it's not greater than 25, then we're done. Now we can actually string quite a number of else ifs together into a long chain if we want. And so what this piece of code here is doing is it's taking a number that has been come from somewhere, and we're putting into the variable text the English equivalent of that number. So if number is equal to 0, then we want the text to be the string zero. So if this turns out to be true, then this part of the code is executed. If this turns out to be false, well then we go on to the next part and see what happens. Here this is asking, is number equal to 1? If that's true, then variable text will be set to ONE. If that turns out to be false, well then we go on to the next part and see what's happening there. If number turns out to be 2, we'll set the text equal to TWO. If that's not the case, we'll move on. If it's 3, we'll set that to 3. If that fails, then we'll move on, and so on and so on. And so this actually goes all the way down as far as 10. And it sets the... so finally, if number is equal to 10, then the variable text will be set to 10, TEN. And then we have code here that's saying, I would like text bananas, please. So if number turns out to be 6, it will say, I would like SIX bananas, please. So you can run that example there, that's example 9. This little bit here, this exception here, is just that if it's equal to 1, we don't want to say, I would like 1 bananas, please. We want to say, I would like 1 banana, please. So if number is 1, we have to put an exception there, where we do it this way. Okay? So you can have a look at that there. That code is available to you. Now, I think we could agree that that's a bit cumbersome or a bit inelegant, having a big long sequence of else ifs like that. And so sometimes we can use a switch statement instead of a long sequence of else ifs. So the syntax of a switch looks like this. So we have switch, and then we have some test value. So that's the variable that is going to decide what happens. And then depending on the value of that, we have a bunch of different cases and statements associated with those cases. So we would say we specify case and then a value, and if that value matches the test value, then the statements associated with that will be executed. After each block of statements, we have to say break just to come out of that. That's part of the syntax. So let's have a look at a little example here. So this is, instead of doing if selection is 0, then do this, else if it's 1, do this, else if it's 2, do this, right? So we have a choice here of 0, 1, or 2. So we're saying echo your seat is in. No, so we're saying switch selection. So selection is a variable, and depending then on the value of selection, one of three things is going to happen. So we say case 0. So if selection turns out to be 0, then we're going to say echo economy and then break to come out of that. Case 1. So if selection equals 1, then we're going to echo business. So we'll come out of that. And finally then we have a default setting which will kick in if none of the above has happened. And we'll say echo first. And then we're saying echo class. So what will happen is, if selection is 0, then it'll say your seat is in economy class. If selection is 1, it'll say your seat is in business class. And if selection is anything else, now we were expecting it to be 2, but if it's anything else, it will say your seat is in first class. So we could use case to do the same number to text conversion that we did in the previous example. So let's take a look at that. So this next block of code is doing pretty much as what the previous block did. We're taking a number and then we're generating a string that's the English equivalent of that number. But instead of a whole bunch of if and else ifs, we're using a switch statement with a number of cases. So the number is number 2. That's the variable name. And so if number 2 is equal to 0, then text2 is going to be equal to 0. We say break then as well. So that break is just part of the syntax. That has to go in there. Case 1. So if number 2 is equal to 1, then the text string is going to be ONE. If number is equal to 2, then text is going to be equal to TWO. If number equals 3, then text is going to be THREE, and so on. And at the very end, I've gone all the way down to 12 in this case, and at the very end then, as a default, I've just set loads off. Okay. Pretty much then, as we did before, we just have to have an exception if it's 1. So we say I would like 1 orange, please. But otherwise we're going to say I would like 12 oranges, or I would like 6 oranges, or I would like loads of oranges, please. So this function, or this piece of code here, is going to take a number and then give us a string variable with the English equivalent of that number. And I think we can agree that in this scenario, the switch statement is much more elegant than that big long string of else ifs. Now, of course, this is only useful if you know exactly what the possible values are and if it makes sense to enumerate them one by one. So if you need to do something with a range of values, so let's say if the temperature is between 0 and 10, we're going to do this. If it's between 11 and 20, we're going to do this. If it's between 20 and 40, we're going to do this. Well, you can't use a switch statement for that. That's no good. You'd have to go back to using ifs or nested if thens at that stage. But if you can enumerate all of the possible scenarios, then the switch statement is the way to go. Now, next up, we're going to look at loops. So loops are a very important part of any programming language, and loops execute code over and over again. So sometimes we have a chunk of code that we want to do over and over and over again for whatever reason. Okay. And the first loop we're going to look at is a while loop. So a while loop has a bunch of code that you do over and over again while a particular condition is true. So we might, if we wanted to get drunk, for example, we might say, while you're sober, get a pint. And keep getting a pint until such a time as you're not sober anymore. So as long as sober is true, you keep doing what's inside in the body of the loop. You keep getting a beer. So a while loop will have a Boolean expression or Boolean condition. And as long as that is true, the loop will keep going around and around and around. So there's the Boolean expression part of the loop, and then there's a bunch of statements that will get executed as long as that condition is true. Now, it's very important when you're designing your loop that there is some connection between the condition that decides whether the loop keeps going around or not and the body of the loop, so that you don't keep going forever and ever and ever. So inside in the body of the loop, you must make some progress towards changing the condition. So if, for example, you had, while sober, get a pint of water, well, that's going to go forever and ever and ever and ever, because a pint of water isn't going to get you any closer to not being sober. So it's very important that when you design the body of your loop, you make some progress towards getting out of the loop. Now, this loop here is called a pre-test loop, okay? And what this loop does is it checks before going into the loop to see whether the condition is true or not. So it always tests before it goes inside the loop. Now, we'll see in a little later, there's a variation on this. But the important point here is that you don't go inside to the body of the loop unless this condition is true. So let's have a look now at a loop in some detail. Okay. So this loop here is a while loop, and it goes around a bunch of times, and we'll just have a look how that works. So the first thing up here is that it puts 6 into variable I. Now, the next thing then that happens is we go into the while loop and it looks at the condition. And so the test here is variable I less than or equal to 10? Is that true or not? If that's true, then we will go inside in the loop. If it's not true, we'll just jump past it. So is this true? Well, yes, it's true. So we're going around, we're going in. This statement here just says echo star, so we're outputting a star. And then the next statement here is going to add 1 to I. Now that's important because I is what's controlling the loop here. The value of I is what's determining whether we go inside in the loop or not. If we don't take some steps to alter the value of I, then we'll be stuck in the loop forever, which would not be good. So I gets I plus 1, so I is now 7. And so we come out of the loop and we go around again and we look at the test. So the question here now is I less than or equal to 10? If that's true, we'll go into the loop. If it's not true, we'll jump over it. Is that true? Well, yes, it's true. So we're going back in. So we say echo star, and we have another star there now. And we say I gets I plus 1. So now I is 8. So we've come to the end of the body of the loop. So we go around again and we check to see if the condition is true or false. So the question here is I less than or equal to 10? If that's true, we'll go inside the loop. If it's false, we'll jump over it. So that's true. So we're going back in again. So now we have another star output there. And the next statement says I gets I plus 1. So now I is 9. We've come to the end of the loop. So we're going to hop back up again now and do the test again. So is I less than or equal to 10? Yes, that's true. So once again, we're going back inside the loop. We have another star output here. The next line saying I gets I plus 1. So now I is equal to 10. So we've finished the body of the loop, so we go back to the test and we're asking the same question again. And the test is I less than or equal to 10? If that's true, we go inside. If it's false, we jump over. Is that true? Yes, it is. I is less than or equal to 10. So we're going back in. We have another star. Next line in the body of the loop says I gets I plus 1. So there we go. Now I is 11. So we've come to the end of the body of the loop now. So we're going back up to the test condition and we're going to see. So is variable I less than or equal to 10? If that's true, we'll go inside the loop again. If it's false, we'll jump over it. Well, it's not true anymore, okay? I less than or equal to 10 is false, so now we jump over. So we don't go into the loop anymore, and we'll just carry on doing whatever we were doing. So you can see with this while loop, we always check to see if the condition is true or not before we go into the loop. Now there is a variant of the while loop which is pretty much the same except for one slight difference. You can have a while loop where you check after you've executed the body of the loop. And so instead of asking if is the condition true, do I go into the loop? You say, okay, if the condition is still true, do I go around again? And this is essentially the same thing. The slight difference though is that this kind of a loop will always execute the body of the loop at least once. So irrespective of whether the condition is true or false, this loop will get executed once. So if you walk into a bar and you always get a pint and then ask, well, should I get another one? That's not necessarily a good idea because maybe you were drunk when you walked in. So if you check first, should you have a pint, and then go around again, that's different to having a pint and saying, should I go again? So it's just a slight variation, but it does, it's something to watch out for because there may be times where you always want the loop to execute at least once, irrespective of what the value is. Now there is another kind of loop we need to look at, and that's called a for loop. Okay, so a for loop executes code a specified number of times. And in this kind of a loop, the body of the loop doesn't need to work towards making the loop condition true or false, because there's no risk of an infinite loop, because the loop is just going to run for a certain number of times. So in essence, the computer keeps count so you don't have to. So we call these for loops, or sometimes we call them for next loops. And the idea is that you specify a starting point and an ending point, and that tells the computer how many times you want to go around. So we could say something like for pint goes from 1 to 5, and then inside in the body we drink a pint. Now this, I must stress, is not the syntax we use in PHP. I'm just using this just to illustrate the idea of a for loop. We'll see the syntax in a little while, okay? So For loop always has some counter variable, and that's automatically incremented after each iteration of the loop. So we specify the counter variable, and typically we use the counter variable inside in the body of the loop as well. It's useful to us. It's available to us and it's useful. Then we have a start value for the counter variable, and we have an end value for the counter variable. And if we were really pushed, we could even specify how much we want to go up by each time we go around, but that's making it more complicated than it needs to be. And then inside in the body of the loop then we'll have a bunch of statements. Now at the end of the body of the loop, the counter is incremented automatically. We don't have to do that. And if it's less than or equal to the end value, then it'll go around again. So if we want to have 5 pints, we can go from 1 to 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's look at the syntax. Okay, the syntax is a bit more cryptic than that. Right, so this is the syntax for a for loop in PHP, and it's similar to the kind you'd have in C as well and many other programming languages. So the for statement has 3 parts to it. The first part specifies the start value of the counter variable. So we must specify the counter variable ourselves. We call it whatever we want, and we give it an initial value. So in this case, the counter variable is I, and its initial value is 1. The next part of the for statement is the test. Okay, and this makes the for loop a bit more like a while loop. We have a test there that we're putting in, and the loop will keep going as long as that is true. When that's no longer true, the loop won't go around anymore. So for this loop to keep going, I would need to be less than 4. The third part then of the for statement is the part where we increment the loop counter. So in this case here, we're doing variable I++, so we're incrementing the loop counter by 1. Inside in the body of the loop then, we'll go around as many times as needs to. We're going to echo variable I here, and then this is going to result then in an output of 1, 2, 3. So I starts off at 1, so we'll echo 1. Next time round, I is 2, so we echo 2. Next time round, I is 3, so we echo 3. And we don't get to 4 because 4 would not be less than 4. So we get 1, 2, 3. Okay? So that's a for loop. We can change the starting and ending parameters. So in this scenario here, in this for loop, the I variable, the loop counter, is initialized to 5, so it starts off at 5. As before, it gets incremented by 1 each time it goes around. We can see that there at the end of the loop, at the end of the for statement. And then in this scenario, the halting condition, that's variable I, is less than or equal to 9. So you'll see before there was a less than, but here it's less than or equal to. So in this scenario, it'll go 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the 9 will be included. So when you're reading a loop, you do have to be careful to watch for that equals. So it can be less than or equals. You can, if you're of a mind, you could start your loop at 100 and count backwards down to 50. You can do whatever you like. You don't even have to increment or decrement by 1 each time. You can put something more complex in there. But for the most part, you will start at 0 or 1 and count up in ones. to some point at which way you'll stop. Just for the devilment, we can have a loop inside in the loop. So here we have an outer loop, and the loop counter there is I, and that's going 5, 6, 7. You see that I doesn't actually get to 8. And then inside in the inner loop, we have another for loop with a loop counter of X, and X goes through 1, 2, and 3, because it's less than or equal to 3. And what we're doing here then in the body of the inner loop is we're outputting I multiplied by X. So you can see the first time when we start off, the outer loop I is equal to 5. And then we go inside the inner loop and X is equal to 1. So 5 times 1 is 5. The inner loop goes around again, so this time X will be equal to 2, and so 5 times 2 will be 10. The inner loop goes around again, and this time X will be equal to 3, and so we have 5 times 3 for 15. Once the inner loop has completed its full run of 1, 2, 3, it stops, and the outer loop I goes around again, this time with I equal to 6. This goes into the inner loop where X is again 1, so we have 6 times 1 for 6. The inner loop goes around again, this time with X equal to 2, so now we have 6 times 2 is equal to 12. The inner loop goes around again with X set to 3, so now we have 6 times 3 for 18. The inner loop finishes its journey, and so the outer loop gets to go around one more time, this time with I set to 7. We start off the inner loop again, where X is set to 1, so we have 7 times 1 for 7. The inner loop goes around again, this time with X being 2, so we have 7 times 2 for 14. And then the inner loop goes around again with X set to 3, for 7 times 3 is 21. So the inner loop finishes its journey and doesn't go around again, and then the outer loop is also finished because the next time around I would be 8 and the condition there would fail. So you can have a loop inside a loop if you really want to be adventurous. Now we need to cast our minds back a bit to when we were talking about variables, because at that time we did not look at arrays. An array is like an apartment block for variables of the same type. And so each value can be referenced by the variable name and an index number. So it would be like the name of the building and the apartment number. The variables we'd seen before were pretty much just like building names with no numbers, but we can actually have a building and a number for a variable store also. So let's have a look here at an example. So here we have an array of strings, and the first item in the array is Tom, the second one is Dick, and so on. You'll notice that the array starts at 0. Okay, in PHP when we're looking at arrays, if they're arrays of if the index is a number, the first one will be 0. We always start at 0. So we talk about the index into an array, or indeed the key of an array. So that's the number, that's the key or the index, and then the value is what's being stored. So if we look at the code here, we have buddies is an array, and in that we have Tom, Dick, Harry, Jane, and Mary. And then we can echo buddies 2. So we can refer to one of the variable stores by the name of the variable and then the index or the key into the array. And so buddies2 is my BFF. We'll say Harry is my BFF. Now it turns out that for loops and arrays work pretty well together. So when we're working with arrays, we usually use for loops to count through the array. Okay. So in this example here, once again we have the same array buddies: Tom, Dick, Harry, Jane, and Mary. I'm saying echo my friends are. Now look at this for loop here. So it starts at 0 and it counts up one by one up to 4. So we echo buddies 0, echo buddies 1, echo buddies 2, echo buddies 3, and echo buddies 4. So this will say my friends are Tom, Dick, Harry, Jane, and Mary. So you can see how arrays and for loops end up working together. Now, of course, this worked for us because we knew to go from 0 to 4 because we knew that's how many things are in the array and that was the size of the array. It turns out in PHP we have a very useful variant of a for loop that's designed specifically for use with arrays. So it's a for each loop. So here we have the same array again: Tom, Dick, Harry, Jane, and Mary. And again we're saying my friends are. But look here at the syntax of this. We're saying for each buddies as value echo value. So you'll notice here there's no need to set up the 0, there's no need to set up the number of items in the array, there's no need to go up one by one. We're basically saying for everything in this array, do this. And so it takes out the value one by one and displays it. Now it turns out in PHP that actually the key to an array doesn't even need to be a number. It can be a string also. So here we have an array of number values. Okay, so the values are numbers, but the key to each element of the array isn't an index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a sequence of characters. And so we can say my costs in March were expenses mar. And this will say my costs in March were $350. Take a look at this here. This piece of code is using the same array, okay? But what we're doing now is we're totaling up the expenses for the year, if this was a full year's worth. And this is in the example that you have. You can see this working and you can tweak it a bit. So we start off by saying total gets 0. And then we're saying for the array itself is called expenses, by the way. Okay. We're saying for each expenses as value, total gets total plus value. So it's going to go through the array item by item by item and adding that item to a running total. So by the time we're done and we've gone through the whole array, it'll say my total expenses for the year came to total. Another variant of an array is a multi-dimensional array. So arrays don't even have to be a single list of values. It can actually be a grid. You can have it. This is a 2-dimensional array here. But you could even have 3-dimensional, or if you really wanted to blow your mind, multi-dimensional, whatever. Here we're saying variable x gets expenses 2, 3 plus expenses 0, 2. So 2, 3 in this case might be 43, and 0, 2 would be 86. We'll add the two of those together. So we will end up using arrays a lot in PHP, so it's worth getting to grips with those, and we do need the loops of course as well. So that's the if statement and the switch statement. Remember, we can only use the switch statement where we can enumerate each of the possibilities. Switch doesn't really work for ranges of values. For that, you're going to have to resort again to the nested ifs or the trailing, else ifs. And we also had a look at loops. Remember, we can, in a while loop, we can have a post-test loop or a pre-test loop. They work pretty much both the same, but remember that the post-test loop is always going to run through the code at least once, whereas the pre-test is going to check first before it goes in. And then we had the for loops. They're very important. We use for loops a lot in PHP, and we also have in PHP the very special for loop when we're working with arrays.